What would you want people that are not immigrants to understand?
You won't ever be able to live through a second life, but I think what you can be closest to it is, I think, it's the value of traveling. Every time you go into a new environment and you assimilate into different cultures, the closest one will also be to speak a different language. Because one of the things that I never fully appreciated growing up was being bilingual meant that I had access to two worlds of ideas. More often than not, you might find that there's certain languages that have stories or values or things that can only be spoken in that one language that doesn't have a better like direct translation. And because of
Yeah.
that, it means that culturally people couldn't identify or think or even conceive of the idea of what it meant for that particular word or phrase.
Welcome to an inspirational people interview on the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm speaking with entrepreneur John Chan. John, say hello.
Jason, good to meet you.
John is an entrepreneur renowned for his expertise in web UX design and digital marketing. Born in Hong Kong and raised in Vancouver, John dropped out of university at the age of 19 to start his own web design consultancy. Since then, he worked for several prestigious companies, including UBC and Basecamp, before co-founding his agency, X Growth Agency. This agency specializes in helping e-commerce and DTC brands grow and scale with paid ads and ad creative development. So John, you and I have a lot of shared history. Let's dive into your story. Where do you come from and how did it unfold? Tell us who you are.
You know what's it's funny because we started the whole thing not kind of by accident. So as you alluded to in the introduction, I dropped out of school at 19, but partly because I was a bit disenchanted with school and I found that school was kind of slow for me. It wasn't until maybe like 14 or 15 years later after that before I found out that I had ADHD, and that played a non-trivial sort of like role in that thought process. But as you and I talked about earlier before the show, we both grew up at a time where we watched the internet develop into what it is today. We saw, before the dot-com boom and the bust that comes along with it, along with, Web 2.0 emerge and mobile devices. So we saw a lot of things that emerged during this process. And what really helped was learning and adopting and rapidly changing within the landscape was a really great advantage. And I think in a lot of ways, I just kind of rode the wave. And so we'll get into the specifics a little bit later around that, but I think that's kind of the broad theme.
Yeah, yeah. So what would you say some of the biggest, I think you and I, really in a lot of senses our generation pioneered just the types of things that unfolded over the course of technology through the 90s, the early 2000s, and up to today. Now we're in the AI revolution. So so it was definitely an opportunity for you to take advantage of, but what did you find were a lot of the hurdles and challenges that you faced, along your story, like some of the big moments of like where you really grew?
Mm. I mean, I think a lot of it really boils down to uncertainty. And I think, for people that are listening that didn't see the juxtaposition of, what is it like looking ahead and it wasn't very clear, I think it's kind of looking at the way that AI is shaping right now, where you can't really tell where things would go. And that's why I would hesitate to call myself a pioneer, because in a lot of ways, when I'm just adopting all these products or tools, everybody's just kind of figuring it out too. And in that sense, I think there's that the analogy might make sense. But a lot of it was just not based on boldness, but out of curiosity and tinkering and playing around with things.
Yeah.
And so I think it felt a lot more like play than us trying to explore sort of like new territory. But I think looking backwards, it's there's a lot of aspects of this industry or just working with the web that afforded us a lot of really interesting opportunities and lifestyles that had emerged. That I think was the one sort of guiding sense that I knew it was going to be the right call. So I'll stick with
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
What, yeah. So dive into that idea of like play and curiosity versus in terms of from your point of view, but also in direct contrast to those that might see those changes as terrifying and scary and with trepidation.
Sure. I mean, I think for me specifically, I can't speak for everybody else. I think in general, the things you get really good at don't feel like work. And so, for me back in high school, I, wouldn't have thought I wanted to have a career doing web development or anything like that, or working with the web in general. It was actually closer towards, as a kid, I grew up watching a lot of, Miyazaki Hayao films. I got inspired by a lot of that kind of thing. And so I actually wanted to be an animator growing up. So I was always good at drawing, right? And so art and design was always this kind of like outlet for me to play and have creativity around. And it was one of those things that when I spent my time into the late hours building projects, it was always um it didn't feel like work. And so it would translate, when my assignments were given in high school that, I had something that I had to do, and I would just go way over the top. And the teachers would be like, yo, like you're already getting like full marks for this. Like, what are you doing it for? But of course, it wasn't about the external validation, it was because it was fun. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of like the early signs. But when you carry that throughout the rest of your career, a lot of it boils down to that, right? And so for today, a lot of it is around meeting people or building people or uncovering what are the unique strengths and weaknesses, whether if it's individual contributors that work with you, or whether if it's brands that have stories that could have been said better if you could tie it back to the origin story of like how they started the company versus how they got to their product. That there's just all these unearthed sort of like interesting stories that could have been told. And so marketing or design just happened to be the medium to communicate those type of things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's about having that message and having a vehicle to share it. So you were born in Hong Kong, raised in Vancouver. How old were you when that transition happened, and what was it like for you growing up?
I was like, so I was this is 93. So if you for some backstory, if you're familiar with like Hong Kong, this is right before Hong Kong was returned to China. There was a lot of uncertainty from people that were immigrating at that time about, what it was like to have like a communist like, rule or what have you. Um and there was a lot of like fears around that. And so I was part of that wave that left before. But I think, I never really fully appreciated what that really meant until I got older. And so nowadays, if I go back to different areas, but being an immigrant meant that it was the classical story of, you had your parents that basically give up everything, drop all your social ties,
Yeah.
drop all your career ambitions, just so that your children can have a better future. And it translates directly to, well, speaking the language natively, being able to work in that environment, or being able to code and those type of things. That was like, of course, if you look back now, it's a crazy advantage that people that would have stayed in that particular region wouldn't have had. And for me,
Yeah.
seeing that juxtaposition kind of gave me like the sense and a certain way of conviction of like, why wouldn't I do this? Why wouldn't I go all in and develop and take a swing at the bat when I have all these things sort of given to me in a sense. And so for me, part of going down a path of entrepreneurship was for me, it felt like I couldn't squander the opportunity of what was in front of me. And so it felt like that, although like later on, but it did certainly feel like that in the beginning.
Yeah. What was it like to be an immigrant in China or in Canada?
Well, in our world, I'm part of Vancouver, where there's a lot of Asian people that were co-located as well, because there's a large influx of people that moved there. And so it was interesting because I found myself between two worlds, where on one hand there was a sense of how do I preserve my own cultural identity and cultural history, or what the implications of that. And so for that, it meant that my parents would put me into Chinese school, and at school I'll end up speaking Chinese with certain of my friends while I'm learning English as a second language and developing all these kind of areas, and sort of like figuring out which part of the identity do I gravitate towards more? Do I, because I noticed that there are certain people that immigrated that stayed closer to home culturally. And so they never fully assimilated into the new environment, whereas others would, basically be Canadianized or Americanized, and they'll have like a certain identity emerge out of it. And I probably was towards the latter, where when I saw the two worlds, I had two older brothers where I could sort of see that sort of like cultural gap. I ended up gravitating towards being more westernized in a certain sense, because I saw some of the advantages both socially, that and other areas where it just, I don't know how to say it, like it there were certain advantages to that, which I'll try to articulate better, because it was one of those things where I felt once I got back home, but I didn't fully understood growing up, but I just felt it.
Yeah. What would you want people that are not immigrants to understand? What would you hope that they would see through your eyes that maybe they don't see because they don't have that experience?
I think the best way to do it, you won't ever be able to live through a second life, but I think what you can be closest to it is, I think, is the value of traveling. Every time you go into a new environment and you assimilate into different cultures, the closest one will also be to speak a different language. Because one of the things that I never fully appreciated growing up was being bilingual meant that I had access to two worlds of ideas, right? So, for yourself, I don't know if you're bilingual as well, but more often than not, you might find that there's certain languages that have stories or values or things that can only be spoken in that one language that doesn't have a better like direct translation. And because of
Yeah,
that, it means that culturally people couldn't identify or think or even conceive of the idea of what it meant for that particular, you know, word or phrase
because
or
there's a
idiom or
tradition in history. Yeah,
a little bit, but it's kind of like, you know, what is water to a fish, what is air to a bird, what is language to a human. There's a saying around that where just
yeah,
because you're a fish doesn't mean that, you know, anything outside of that doesn't exist. But the fact that there's a very rich world, it's completely like inconceivable to you. And so for me, being bilingual just also made me realize that I have all these access or these cultures that I don't fully understand. Where when I work with other people and other different brands, I try to tap into that. Like, what do you see in your world that I don't? Whether if it's an age difference, you know, for a generational gap, or if it's a language difference that I hope they preserve and keep because they may not realize that in a lot of cases that's actually um, either a superpower or an advantage that they could use or exploit in a way that someone that doesn't speak the language or that culture understand. So not directly tied to immigration, but that exposed me to that sort of like
yeah,
the gap.
yeah. There are a lot of people out there that can be fearful of immigrants or have contempt towards them. What would you want to speak to them? What would you say to those people?
Well, I don't have a direct message for them per se because I kind of understand it. Because again, coming from a place where, you know, I live in both worlds where like identify as a Canadian, but I also started off as immigrant, I can see why that anytime there's an influx of new people that either don't fully understand the rules or don't understand the culture or whatever, it would just kind of like or there's also like economic sort of questions around, you know, all kinds of things. So I guess for me, for anyone that's frustrated about that kind of thought process, I would identify and understand, not identify, but like I would understand where they're coming from. But more often than not, even if you know, whether if it's policies that you disagree with, what have you, more often than not, when you spend time and you get a chance to meet with all these people like firsthand, a lot of those sort of like, you know, differences and prejudices and biases sometimes it would break away if you had a chance to break bread with somebody or get to learn the cultures and you realize that, oh, wait a second, behind all of these things there's people with stories, there's people that are
Yeah,
leaving home to live a better life. They're just like us in a way where they're trying to fight for better what's best for their family. And so I think finding commonality amongst our differences is what I would hope more people would get to experience.
yeah. Yeah, so let's kind of move a little bit forward in your story. You and I definitely share a lot in common. I had a marketing agency for about 7 years, 2007, 2014. I also moved. I wasn't as dramatic as you, but I moved from Arizona, the west side of the U.S., to Atlanta, Georgia, and I was a sort of a foreigner in a land. Although it wasn't as dramatic, it was definitely very difficult being an outsider. Just sort of the normal stuff outside of even the cultural stuff, being somewhere new, having no community, having to start those relationships. Also an animator as well. Grew up in
Nice.
doing 3D animation, and actually my bachelor's is in animation as well. So
Nice.
lots of fun connections. But we definitely share that connection with the agency, and and you've leaned into that. So you've co-founded this company. Tell me why you co-founded this company and the timing of when you did it.
Sure. I'll do a quick backstory. So you touched on the fact that I did design when I immediately left school. That was 2006. And so between 2006 to 2011 or so, I was doing a lot of
Yeah.
UX and design work. But around 2012, I left the university that I was working at um, to get into conversion optimization as a consultancy. And it didn't last very long because shortly after starting that, I got hired by 37 Signals to work as a conversion designer. So doing that within
Okay. And
a
were you
corporation.
working? So that's another funny one. We were one of your clients when I had my agency. We used
Nice.
Basecamp for project management. But were you a contractor or an employee?
I was an employee. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I worked
Okay.
directly with
Wow.
Jason Fried. Yeah, it was interesting
Yeah.
because it was really hard to get in, right? And so I somehow
Yeah.
rose the ranks and got to the top. But that also didn't last very long too. But what's interesting about that sort of stint was that around the time when I joined the company, they invested in one of the first coding boot camps to ever exist. It was back then it was called Code Academy. It later rebranded to the Starter League. But that exposure gave me a chance to learn how to write software. And so with that experience, you know, at the time was my girlfriend, my now wife. We started a software company called Dayboard. It was a productivity software, and so for that product, we built something that was beautiful and was useful and was you know we had customers that really loved us, but we couldn't commercialize it and make it sustainable for the life of us. And so around the time towards the end of that journey, that was around 2016. One of my takeaways was one of two things. One was I knew that I needed to learn how to be a better CEO. I ran that product as a product company with just a bunch of people like hacking away, as opposed to figuring out how to build an organization. That was one skill gap that was clear during that experience. But the second one that I didn't quite fully understood was the process of user acquisition. And so going back to consulting initially, so if you look at our name, it's 2X conversion design. That's the official legal name. It's because in 2016, when we started the agency, we started off consulting doing what I was doing previously in 2012, which was A/B testing as a service. We contracted with different software companies, different e-commerce companies, doing split testing as a thing. Except we later quickly found out that it wasn't a really good service to sell sustainably, because if you had a really great design and you beat existing design, now you have to beat the one that you just designed. And so it was kind of
Yeah.
incrementally harder, and it was not a very long sort of like tail in terms of you had like a diminishing sort of like like a natural churn to your business. And so we looked at it adjacently. Well, we still wanted to learn how to do user acquisition. And so we had a chance with one of the brands to work with that we saw that they were running Google Ads, they weren't running it very well. And so we just kind of like, worked our way in, and we doubled down on doing media buying in 2019. And with the expectation that when things work, brand owners want to spend more, and we would have a much longer LTV with as a service to sell. And we built expertises around that. And so all the conversion design, all the UX, all the technical aspect of software writing helped with the agency, because we became sort of like a full-fledged, like full service agency in terms of the different touch points we would have: landing pages, ad creative production, and media buying, because that encompasses the entire user acquisition channel.
Yeah, that's interesting. And how has that evolved since you launched the company? That was 2019 you launched it?
Well, it was 2016, and so
Okay.
2019 was when we doubled down and just did media buying, and since
Oh,
then
okay.
it's been a lot. I mean, we've had some like setbacks early on, right? But I think overall, I think this is probably one of our best years, and it's been growing ever since. And so I would say, figuring out the mechanics of how to sell software aside from just selling a service, as opposed to just figuring out the aspects of this media buying in itself. We talk a lot about the technical aspect of it. That was a bit of a learning curve as well. So I didn't cut my teeth doing sales, right? But had to learn quickly on the job, the kind of thing. And so right now we're a team of 8. We have a bunch of contractors and agencies, some agencies that work with us, and being able to service, again, like I said, the 3 aspect of landing pages, Google Ads, and Facebook ads, primarily paid social and paid search, and it works quite well.
Yeah. So if you were to succinctly say, what do you do and who do you do it for in terms of the outcome you create and who you create that outcome for, what would how would you answer that?
Yeah, I would say that we help brands that have found product market fit scale sustainably, which is what it comes down to. So if you're doing paid media buying for e-commerce or software companies, that's where we primarily service. But if they have some sense that things are already working, we figure out what that is, reverse engineer, and how to make it even better.
Yeah. And that's actually really one of the most exciting parts of in terms of online businesses particularly is scaling, because once you've figured it out, scaling is the fun thing, right?
100%. It's a fun thing, but also sometimes a scary thing, because you have a lot of
Yeah.
like dollars at stake, right? So, but yeah, when you see a brand go from $2 million to 25, it's a hell of a ride, right? So.
Yeah. So talk to us, like, you've gone through a lot in your life. I want to talk about the idea of like, what does it mean to you to live better? How do you think about that idea, and how do you live your life in such a way that that it allows you to thrive and flourish?
I mean, I would caution against giving a life advice, and I would speak to what has really worked well for me. Because in general, when I think back, I'm very happy with my life. I found a partner that I'm very happy with. I live a lifestyle that I'm very happy with. I have a lot of happy friends and people that support us and that kind of thing. So I think you know for me, living better really boils down to knowing what you're working backwards from, and drawing a line in the sand, and not being pressured into doing the things that other people think that you should be doing. And I think that finding that quiet sense of what do I really want, I think a lot of people really struggle with. And I was kind of lucky to figure that out for myself.
Yeah.
Um, And so I think for a lot of people, it's figuring out what that really means for you so that you can live boldly and not worry about and never second guess a lot of your decisions.
Yeah. So, how do you stay aligned to your values under pressure? Pressure from clients or team members or social or cultural pressure?
Well, it's always tough, right? Because I think the best way to say when you're most aligned is when you have it's a bit of a power dynamics where I point out to, which boils down to not needing from anything from anybody else. Is kind of like where it comes down to how to stay true to values. I think there are times in our past when we have to take projects or work that we didn't feel like we really wanted to take, but you needed to pay the bills, that kind of thing, and that would send you a certain direction. But when you have the opportunity and chance to say, no, I don't want to take this project, or no, I don't want to work with this group of people, I think that really allows you to stay true to your values. And I think it's also easier when you have environments that you have control over. So when it comes to right working with as an at a company that I didn't align with, changing the culture means getting alignment and buy-in from everybody else. But for a company that you created and started, it's asking yourself, who are you, and what do you care about, and what do you enforce the rest of your team, and figuring out, who fits within that sort of mold. So I think a lot of it really comes down to understanding what you're giving in, what you're giving up, and can you afford to give it up? And a lot of it comes down to having the power to choose.
Yeah. Now, on the work side, what do you think about when you hear the phrase working smarter?
Hmm. I think a lot of working smarter to me means leverage, right? Leverage, whether if it's in human or capital or automation, the robots. I think a lot of it really comes down to um, knowing the difference between the architect versus the construction worker, for example. And it's not to say to downplay any one role, but you would definitely look at someone that, does like physical labor as hard work, right? And so working smarter and looking at knowledge worker as a category, you see why people would, like coming from an Asian background, my parents never enforced this on me, right? But it's like there's a reason why everybody cared a lot about having a strong education and having, working to be like engineers, doctors, or like accountants, that kind of thing, right? Like that's kind of classic joke. But the reason why is because they grew at a time when they saw the difference between being well educated would lead you to a proper middle class versus not. Now, that advice may be outdated in a certain sense, but if you think about what that the 21st century equivalent of that would be, it means figuring out which part of work allows you to create the lifestyle or the leverage that you want. So for me, working smarter a lot means leverage.
Yeah. So when you think about leverage and also scale, I think a lot of entrepreneurs or business owners, they get that in a sense, but they don't really lean into that. They don't really take advantage of that. I mean, we all fail to, I guess, live up to that idea as much as we probably could. So talk to us about what you've learned about leverage and scale that could help us in that journey forward.
Sure. I mean, I'll talk about my own experiences because I think that helps me think about things in one way. But there's tools available to you to think this through as you're thinking about how this applies to your business, right? But like for me, working through the type of work mattered a lot. For example, I mentioned earlier that we used to do design as a service, but design is hard to teach. Design is hard to find good talent for, and it's expensive to find good talent for, or at least good design, right? And so it means that picking a business model that sold design meant that I would have a harder time scaling like human capital or human resources rather. And so that just meant that that type of work, if I were to make a bigger impact, it'll be constrained to however many people, like how many good designers can hire. Compared to doing advertising, right? If I work at a campaign that is managing $5,000 a day versus $10,000 a day versus $100,000 a day, like I'm still sitting behind a computer, like tweaking some campaign on pressing through a few buttons, right? But the impact is that the same level of work would have at a much larger scale and much larger leverage, even though and of course the work is more difficult and it's different, but it's just fundamentally like a different set of scale, right?
Yeah.
Other types of so a lot of it within the actual work looks and feels like that of like what's not always about easy, but much easier to manage, I would say, right? And how easy it is to train or how easy it is to hire and fire. And so I think, for anyone that's listening and trying to figure out what that is for themselves, a lot of part of it is, just going through ChatGPT and say like, hey, I do X service. How do I think about this from a scalable way? What are different ways I can think about, or what areas I should spend most of my energy and time on versus what areas I can figure out how I can delegate to somebody else or figure out how to delegate to bots or automations, right? I think if you start asking those type of questions, a lot of interesting answers would emerge, especially ones that you may not have thought about.
Yeah. Now, where does mentoring come into the story for you?
I mean, lots. I mean, for me, like everyone looks at the individual and see like, oh, wow, that person is so smart. But anyone that goes through that and gets a lot of that, never would want to fully take credit because they know that they're standing on shoulders of like other giants. Right? And so for me, again, I was very lucky that I had people that took an early interest in me. One part of my journey was for me training to be an athlete because I wanted to go to Olympics at one point. I trained with the Olympic coach for a long while, and he had a very big impact on me. But I think, and this is also true for a lot of business mentors as well. But I think a large part of having mentors in your life is just having someone that have been through certain things that you otherwise would not have known. And so for someone that wants to identify what that really feels and means, is to just look at their current knowledge of what they know in their current life and ask what they could have told someone that's 10, 15, 20 years younger than them. And what advice they would have given. Just the fact that you've lived through something is hard to explain without having gone through it. And so talking to somebody on the opposite end of that to skip all the BS and all the side quests of you trying to figure out this for yourself is hugely important. And that was again instrumental for me as well.
Yeah. So, what would you tell your 19-year-old self that just dropped out of college?
Trust your gut. Don't second guess, trust your gut. And I think that's one thing that has been very helpful. But I think I caused myself a lot of stress along the way for all the things that I was hoping going to work out, but didn't, or didn't think was going to work out, but did. I think there's just too much overthinking involved, and again, wouldn't have known better at the time. But
Yeah.
just being able to drop a lot of the stress would have made it a lot more enjoyable. And I still enjoy it today, but it's
Yeah.
just right.
Yeah. How have real or fictional stories or narratives shaped you as a person?
I mean, I like reading biographies. I like learning. You just talked about mentorship. So I think, learning about other people and their lives and seeing how they live. I mean, I'm talking to you in Tokyo on a cruise ship. And large part of that would be only because I read For Our Work Week in like 2008, right? Where I was at a desk job and I was imagining like, wow, how would someone actually even live like this? And then 4 years later, I find myself sitting in Thailand in some cafe, like, working on an app, right? And so I think, just seeing a lot of different people live their life in ways that I would not have thought of had a, would had a big influence on me. So Tim Ferriss definitely had that. My old boss, Jason Fried, had a lot of that as well. And the way that I think about my company and company building, I would definitely say a lot more nonfiction than fiction. I'm a little bit guilty around that, and I've been told not to. And so I should read more fiction, that kind of thing. But I think the other one would also be going back to like the earlier years and early days of animation and a lot of Miyazaki films have probably impacted me in a very deep way where I probably saw a lot of magic and wonder in a lot of things that, when other people thought it was lame or something that they wouldn't invest themselves into, I would, it fueled my curiosity. So I think having that influence me at a young age led to a lot of interesting experiences as I got older, only because when I read things that didn't identify with the norm, I would believe in it.
Yeah. Which of his movies was your favorite?
Mm. I actually like Nausicaa, like Valley of the Wind.
Okay.
That was probably the first one for me.
Yeah, yeah. I grew up on Princess Mononoke, so
Mm.
that was one of my
Very good
faves.
as well.
Yeah. So, stories, are one part of the formula. Then we also have systems.
Mm.
So, talk to us about how you think about systems in your business, in your life, and your work.
Yeah. So I think so right now, there's somebody that's very influential for me. His name is Dan Martell. He spends a lot of time talking about operations and agency oh, sorry, not just not agency operations, but he talks a lot about operations and systemizing is what a big core theme. So I'm going to basically rip a lot of the concept here, where one of the things he talks a lot about is audit transfer fill. Right. So if you're looking at a process delegation, let's say you're doing something and you want to look at, let's say your 40-hour work week and you say, hey, within that, what work are you doing on a given basis that doesn't have to be done by you? And so if you go through the chain of, well, I don't have to really need to do admin work, that could be offloaded to somebody else. The process of recording that having that shared by somebody else and then passing it off to somebody else and then following with something else is kind of a process that we've been adopting quite heavily and been quite successful at, I would say, over the last couple of years. And so,
Yeah.
very broadly, agencies are a business of operations of SOPs, right? So figuring out which part of things are repeatable so that you can, do it once, pass and share it to somebody else, and have them do it to the same level of effectiveness or better. I think is the game, and that's how we've been thinking about a lot of the work that we do. What are some things that we're doing today that can and should be handed off, and then we just go through the process of doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really getting into YouTube now, and that's one of my advice to other YouTubers, and something I'm doing is if someone asks me for advice, instead of just like writing out this long email, just do a video, put it on my channel, and then share it with them, and then now all of a sudden a lot of
100%.
people can see that. Yeah.
100%.
So it's that scale and leverage, like you said earlier, right?
Mhm.
Now, you did mention that, I would be curious just from what kind of advice or systems insight you would give for someone that is interested in location independence entrepreneurship or being a digital nomad.
Mhm.
Since you've gone down that road, like what would be some tips you'd give to someone that's interested in that type of work and lifestyle?
Sure. I think the first is know how to run your business, remotely. So it means if you're like working, finding clients and working remotely, if you're hiring people, how to hire and manage remotely. Other things would be like how to manage, like automations, right? Like all these things, it's a muscle that you build, but once you figure out how to do it, it's kind of like voodoo for other people, right? So if you have a co-located business and you only know how to find local clients, figure out how to get that transition to go from location dependence. I think that makes it look it's really important. And again, a large part of that concept comes from the fact that a lot of the work that we do right now is location. Like a lot of people that we hire is location dependent already. If you look at hiring an accountant, you don't have the accountant go to your office. If you hire a lawyer, you don't have the lawyer go to your office. So how do you manage that type of
Yeah.
work? And so if you think through the process of, well, I only care about the results that you produce, right, and not the hours that you work, and you can find a ways to manage and systemize that, and then also produce that for clients and how to build trust and autonomy so that they don't have to check on you, that kind of thing. I think all those things are really important. So having the tools and processes to manage your business and operations, that's one aspect of it. How to manage your team members and your clients, that would be another aspect of it. And then I think with the other third part would be with the different tools in terms of like your like how do you get paid internationally? How do you make sure like you can, cross, like having different tools, do automations for automations where if you wanted to hand something off, but you can hand it to a bot. Like there's aspect of it, but each one of these things are individual skills that you build, and once you figure it out, and again, I'm not the only person that done it. There's lots of documentation around this kind of thing. Again, ChatGPT. Hey, I'm trying to build a location independent business for this particular industry. How could I start working towards that? And just walk it on a list, and you probably have a step-by-step instruction of how to go about doing that.
Yeah. How would you define the difference between good design and bad design, whether it's an interface or a business or something else?
I mean, the classic example is that, most people think about design about is what it looks like, but design is how it works, right? Steve Jobs said that. When you think about, what makes something well designed, a lot part of it comes down to, how do people engage with that particular interface? And so when don't focus on the immediate visuals and you focus on the things that people like engage with and how they feel, I think is what it comes down to. And for people that want to know how to identify good design, it's helpful when you know how to be sensitive to how you think and feel as you're going through certain things. Because a lot of us can may not be designers in the traditional sense, but know how to experience things, right? Whether if it's food or whether if it's, physical products. And so being able to be sensitive to why you enjoyed a particular product or experience or why you didn't, and be able to articulate that, that's sort of the core foundations for what translates to good design, right? And that's covered in a lot of topics and, from Don Norman to, you know, um, Don't Make Me Think, but a lot of it comes down to like what people experience because design is about the people behind the scenes at the end of the day. And so if you can identify and have empathy towards that, you have a good sense of what makes a good design.
Yeah. Why is there so much bad design at all? Why aren't people just naturally creating great design?
I think it's because they fundamentally don't understand what the job is. Because design, they'll look at something like Canva or Photoshop, and the intuition is the counterintuitive thing is to look at what you visually see because that's the most visual part. And a lot less think about the thing behind the design, right? And so, for example, like, most people, and again, I learned this from my old boss, where, you can't have great design if you don't understand how to communicate well, both visually from like, iconography or what have you, or with words. So if you're not a good writer, it's hard for you to know how to write a design well. You take any interface, any product, any app, and you take away all the words, like, can people still use it? And if not, that speaks to why something is done poorly. So I think people just get too caught up with how something visually looks because that's what they think design is supposed to be when it's not really that, right?
Yeah. So what's the best way to avoid distractions then?
In terms of
In
designs.
terms, because that yeah, that's or just principally at a core level, because those distractions cause you to do bad designs, but they also cause you to make other mistakes as well.
Fair. I mean, it's to figure out what the opposite of that is, which is focus, right? So if you figure out what to
Yeah.
focus on, then all the stuff melts away. And so if you look at, again, being in Tokyo right now, I think about this a lot, right? But if you look at why there are a lot of great designers that emerge in Japan, is because they know how to identify a particular product or design or visuals and remove away all the things that are necessary. And so what you're left with are things that are very simple, and that's permeated within their culture, whether if it's with their food or the art and what have you. Everything is thought about, how do I remove all the things that I don't need and are left with just the things that makes this fundamentally what it is. And if you can identify with that is, you can also figure out how to extend from it and build, visual flares or, slight improvements. But a lot of the innovations around those type of core concepts is understanding what the core job really is.
Yeah. So if clarity of focus is the antidote, why is there so much lack of focus?
Because it's hard to see, I think, is what it comes down to. And I think a lot of really good designs require deep thoughts, right? And so it's to really answer the question of like, what does this really mean, right? And it's kind of like answering the question of like, what do I want in my life? Right. Like most people are not very good at introspection or struggle with the process of introspection. And so being good at looking at, themselves or a product or an object and identify, if you remove the things that aren't needed, what are you left with? I mean, again, it's a muscle that you build. And so when you look at Apple products is an exact example of that, right? 1,000 songs in your pocket, like that's all it boiled down to, is, and all the bells and whistles and bells and features aren't needed. I think a lot of us intuitively get that. But when you look at something and say, "Hey, what is not needed?" I think it leads to what most people are looking for. But and I would also say there's another aspect of it, which is, removing certain things is very difficult in the design process, but it's also because it's very attractive and very alluring to add things, because that's sometimes the trap of thinking of how do you take something and make it better, right? Very rarely do you look at something and say, you know what, how do I take stuff away to make it better? More often than not, it's very intuitive to say, well, my product's got this thing over here, so what kind of improvement I'm going to make? Well, I better add this new feature. So before I was able to do this, now I'm able to do this and this, right? And in the process
Hmm.
of doing that, initially isn't so bad, but 12 or 15 iterations in of 12 or 15 features in, afterwards you realize, wait a second, I'm now diluted the things that I've initially started off with. And so that's why, Jason Fried had a great saying, actually. He said, it's simple until you make it complicated. And I think that's
Yeah.
why a lot of people, if you think about design, bad designs usually emerge because they overcomplicate things.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're in an era, and this might have to do with where I'm at and people that are, I guess, high achievers that are doing a lot, but they're successful. They've solved a lot of problems and they're in that scale and leverage mode, perhaps. I think we're in an era, at least for that group of people, where we're not looking for generic or general solutions. We're looking for very specific solutions to very specific problems. So you mentioned the idea of like adding all of these things, and the elegance like of a logo design that's simple but conveys like a visual impact or a message. And you could take that to really any angle, but let's take like a book or a course, like a course. You could solve like 100 problems, or you could have one course that specifically solves one specific problem. and any of the other things you add to that actually cloud solving that one thing, right? And I actually think AI is one of the interesting layers about AI, and one of the things that I've discovered it to be effective at is doing that very thing. It's finding that problem and solving that thing. So if I Google, I know kind of the difference between what to Google and what to look for in ChatGPT in terms of getting an answer, and it really comes down to just getting very specific about that very specific thing from a specific point of view. So I don't know. What would you do? You have anything you would add to that or say about that idea?
I mean, I think that's true to a certain extent. And I think part of it is that when you look at any type of specialization, I think what also is implied there is also what type of thing should you specialize in. So for example, if you think about like, kitchens, right? Kitchens have a lot of different utilities. Like, so for me, when I think about like, a product that's specialized in just like, crushing garlic, like it's designed for this one job. And next thing you know, you got like, 200 gadgets sitting in your thing. And then you have a lot of simple tools, but you have a very complicated kitchen, right? So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
you know, um, when you think about products that are fundamentally well designed, they tend to have a lot of utility. And so when you have something that's very simple and very elegant, but have a lot of flexibility around it, I think that's kind of the reason why you look at something like ChatGPT and said, oh, it's very simple and elegant because a lot of the utility that can emerge from this one simple chat interface. But again,
Yeah.
it's also a good, interesting example because you look at the models and you're like, look at chat, and now it's like you got O3, O3 mini, you got O4, and it's like you got like a hodgepodge of like different LLMs to choose from. But it didn't start off that way, right? Because it's this
Yeah.
sort of set of like, oh, I gotta add deep research now. And so it's like it's a product that started off very simple, it has a lot of utility behind
Yeah.
it, and it's got a lot of multi-purposes, but it kind of evolves into this sort of like Frankenstein of a mess where it's like, who cares, man? I
Yeah.
just I'm just gonna type in a chat box, and if you know the context of the question, you pick the model for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so a lot of these type
Yeah.
of things that are enforced on the end user ends up being things that, again, can kind of go back to its roots. But to go back to the sort of the question around, how I think about specialized products, specialized tools, I think specialization is one really important aspect of it. But something that is very simple should also have a lot of utility and a wide range of utility. So, I look at like a chef knife, a classic knife, like that has a lot of utility. And so if you're a master
Yeah.
at your craft, you master the one thing, now you can take this one tool and do a lot with it, right? So I think of something like that as the way that I think about specialization. So for me personally, I tend to be a generalist. I mean, as you can sort of see my career arcs, I think in that way. Um, I play in that I play in that lane.
Yeah. But I think as a generalist, the specialists complement you. So then you kind of are looking at the larger picture, and then you're leveraging the specialists to do specific things within your company, with things like that.
In a sense, I would say, because I think I tend to focus on the things that don't change, right? So, for example, if I know that I'm not going to be as good of a UX designer that is current with their design skills today, I look at the things that don't change. User behaviors don't change. User psychology doesn't change. And so, if I think about design thinking, if I learn those skills in, early 2000s, right? Those things would be timeless and they'll carry over with me, even in like 2 decades from that, right? So
Yeah.
I try to focus on those things as a way to be an effective generalist because what that affords me to do is it allows me to do cross-domain thinking. So how do I think about design? Sorry, how do I think about marketing in the context of design? How do I think about, you know, marketing in the context of a software developer? And I think that created a lot of really interesting opportunities to solve problems in ways that I think someone that doesn't have that cross-domain specialty
Yeah.
will be able to do.
Yeah. So talk to us about the importance of fusing two disparate ideas that don't seem connected but allow you to see something new.
I think it's where a lot of original ideas come from, right? So again, one of the ways I like to look at it is I look at, food and cultures is one of those things where it's very easy to emerge, see like, oh, when you have like somebody with two different backgrounds or a mix of backgrounds, you see a lot of really interesting things emerge. And so, again, it goes back to a little bit around being an immigrant, right? Just to close the loop here, because, I come from a place of two worlds and I saw the effectiveness and the beauty of having the two different identities like emerge to create something new and something unique and something special. And a lot of it is also true within the context of work, right? Because if you can think like a designer or think like a marketer in the context of design, you'll understand that the one page that you're designing for have a lot of implications that you otherwise would not be able to had you been only focused on that one thing. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of interesting and original ideas emerge when you share domains. And it's also true not just for, I talked a lot about design and marketing, but it's also true for sports, right? So if you're a baseball player, or in my case, I was a taekwondo martial artist or practitioner, that translated into a lot of the way that I think about my work that only is unique to me because that was my unique experience. And so you take that, you apply it to culture, you take that to your background, you take that to your upbringing, you take that to your interest, and next thing you know, a lot of us are appropriately very unique. And being able to source that and apply it to a work in a way that makes it feel like play, I think that's where magic happens.
Yeah, I used to have a client that I worked with. He owned a kitchen remodeling business, and he used to be a former chef. And I was like, well, what better person to design your kitchen than a chef? You know, like that's the
Exactly.
guy you want. But he wasn't telling that story at all. So
Mm,
we said that's the front story, that's the headline, and
100%.
that was a big transformation in his business to be able to
Exactly.
identify
It's like
that
how
and
many
do
people
it.
out there are remodeling to do remodels as a service? Lots. How do they do
Yeah,
that with the background of being a chef? Not that many. And next thing you know, you
yeah,
found your unique value proposition right there.
yeah. And then you create demand, like, wow, that's the guy I wanted to do my kitchen, and you create over time, you can build that demand up. So you've shared a lot with us today. Is there any other final words of wisdom that you'd want to leave us with that you haven't had a chance to share, or that you want to emphasize that maybe you did share?
I mean, I would say that something that's been very helpful for me, throughout my career was that I've always focused on the things that provide a lot of value for other people. And so, you know, for me, what that really meant was that, if I developed skills or worked in environments that allowed me easily to create, let's call it 10 million for somebody else, there's no way that I can make 1 million for myself. So figuring out how to like reverse engineer that was kind of like the career guiding compass. And so, when you hear about my specific version of how I took my career path, it's very hard for someone to listen to this and be able to replicate it, and they're not supposed to. But to figure out that what that means within their own life and take their own stories, I think that's where a lot of really interesting things emerge. And so for me, that was been my guiding compass, and it led me down a lot of different interesting rabbit holes. But somehow I always found ways to close the loop towards the end. And so,
Yeah,
if there's one thing I want to leave people with is to sort of explore and dig into that of like how did it provide value in ways that are much bigger than themselves, and figure out how to capture a small percent of the value for themselves.
yeah. How can people connect with you if they're interested in reaching out or learning more about your business?
Sure. I mean, appreciate that. So our website is 2x.agency. So you can look us up and find us on our we're 2x growth agency. I'm active on, you can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter.
If someone is interested in working with your agency, who's a good fit?
Anyone that have sustainable channels at scale already. So if you're doing, let's call it like $20,000 to $50,000 already existing sales and have some signs of, not your friends and family that are buying your product, that's usually a good sign to talk. We've worked with brands that are a bit earlier than that as well. But the primary thing to do is to have a product that people want and margins to support it. Because once you have that sort of like product market fit, usually we can figure out how to, add fuel to the fire to make that even better.
Cool. Well, thank you, John, for sharing your life with us today. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and this has been an episode of the Share Life Podcast. We'll see you on the next one.
Hey, Jason, it's a lot of fun.